because they said the first two that I read, they are not structured, so it's not probably going to be a deep analysis. Well, don't underestimate my ability to think about things for a really long time, I guess. Do they have titles, or does this one have a title that goes, and here I go over the tribulation of decision and illusion of care? Or is it untitled? Or is it something else? A semi-titled? Hemi-titled? What if we start writing poems and we gave them two titles? That'd be kind of cool, right? To write a poem and that has two titles, and maybe like each title changes the meaning of the poem. Wouldn't that be a fun exercise? I think that'd be kind of cool, but I'm a bit of a nerd. And this is being unresponsive to my touch. Come on. Okay. Technology. Hate it. Hate it and love it. Okay. No, but the next one is called Ruin. It doesn't need a name. It insists upon itself. Okay. So this is Untitled. The other one is Ruin, but we're not reading Ruin. And if this truly is, doesn't take that long, then perhaps we can look at Ruin. But we'll try to give this the time it deserves. So, an untitled poem from Prole0. First ever submission on stream. Thank you so much for sending it. And I will ask this because I usually ask this and forgot to ask on the last poem. Do you have any questions or context or things you would like to note before I start reading the poem? I can go into it totally blind without any of your thoughts. I can also go into it with some amount of direction from you. Either way is cool. But here it is. And here I go over the tribulation of decision and illusion of care. A carousel of Republican signs and counter offers to stupid choices. No one is ever going to want me because I hate the path of death, the path of others. I fall through sleep, awake and brazen with Christian spite to every other because I see myself dying in reverse. One step over the other, falling into the blistered sky once and over again. One step over and on to the next I fall through, burning and old. One step and on to the next. Never gets better. Always gets worse. I see who I am and chart a map to the end. A means to an end. A meaning to the end. One step and on to the next. It never gets better, always gets worse. I see who I am and chart a map to the end, a means to an end, a meaning to the end. I want to feel how I feel when I sleep. I chart a line and cross it, falling on my next step. One step closer as I invert again, falling to my death in reverse, not being caught by the grave, but thrown. This is dope. There's some cool rhythm. You're doing some cool sound stuff. Some like carousel. You have this like fun, almost childlike song. Sounds like a game, this like one step over the other, one step over and on to the next, one step over, or one step and on to the next. Has this fun, rhythm to it. And then again, this sort of repeated So yeah, we have like this refrain, and then we have like this mapping refrain that also happens, gets repeated twice. And it feels very right interconnected. Like this line, this last line, 2 lines, stanza, couplet, this last couplet seems to call back to all sorts of things happening in the poem before it, right? Sleep, charting the line, coming back here, the steps and the next, the reverse and the falling and the death kind of happen up here, and the sleep, right? I want to feel when I sleep. So everything kind of comes very like full circle in this poem. Kind of makes sense, right? We're talking about death, the big capital D end of life, death. And that's like a circle, right? I'm going to try to zoom in on this a little bit. We'll go sort of line by line and try to keep this in the middle. Context would be that I'm practicing poetry for the in-character writing in my fantasies series. Don't really consider myself a poet. But you are a poet because you've written poetry. Okay, so this is sort of practice for, an in-character thing for your book, which is super cool, totally reasonable, and good that you're practicing and not just like throwing out first draft poetry into your novel. I think that's very respectable, right? I think most people, like if I ran into a poem in a novel, I would almost sort of expect sometimes that, oh, it's going to be like a whatever poem because this is a novelist. But trying to make sure that poem is as good as possible is awesome. And you don't really consider yourself a poet, which, I mean, fair. Like if you're not writing that much, if you're not like doing poetry regularly, there's not so much reason to call yourself a poet. But you've written poetry, and that's cool. And honestly, like more props to you for sending it to stream, because it's like not necessarily your thing, right? So I think learning how I would write poetry will help me understand the kind of voice a character would use as a separate, unique people. Oh, yeah. Because we're not just writing, right? The goal isn't just to write. That would be being a poet, right? To just write. We want to write as someone. And this is like a big, difficult goal to sort of practice using a different voice as your own. Because, I mean, people will spend all sorts of time just trying to develop their own voice. I mean, this can take like years and hundreds of poems and all of this time. And I actually do think there are ways to probably shortcut having a control over voice and being able to sort of have a very fluid voice. I think this takes a lot of intention, but I do think it's possible to say, I want to write a poem like this, and then write it. And that's very different, I think, from how most poets write. Because most poets like find their voice and they take their time and their training, and then they try to write, their best poem, their most true, emotional, powerful poem as them, right? This is like what I do. I want to write poetry that's me. But it sounds like that's not necessarily your intention, which is kind of cool. And I think there are a lot of ways to practice this. And we'll come back to this because I want to talk about the poem itself. And maybe we can ask the question, what is your voice what is your style? And it's hard to tell from just one poem that's like really identifiable in this poem. And maybe we can talk about like how would one go about writing this poem in another voice? That might be something we can try to touch on. That's some pretty ambitious goals for stream, but I think it could be fun. So I'm going to read the poem a second time because you should always read the poetry multiple times. And then we'll talk. And here I go over the tribulation of decision and illusion of care. A carousel of Republican sighs. I read it as signs the first time. A carousel of Republican sighs and counter offers to stupid choices. No one is ever going to want me because I hate the path of death, the path of others. I fall through sleep, awake and brazen with Christian spite to every other because I see myself dying in reverse. One step over the other, falling into the blistered sky once and over again. One step over and onto the next. I fall through, burning and old. One step and onto the next. Never gets better. Always gets worse. I see who I am and chart a map to the end. A means to an end, a meaning to the end. One step and on to the next. Never gets better. Always gets worse. I see who I am and chart a map to the end, a means to an end, a meaning to the end. I want to feel how I feel when I sleep. I chart a line and cross it, falling on my next step, one step closer as I invert again, falling to my death in reverse, not being caught by the grave, but thrown. Untitled. So, I think we'll do a little bit, try to quickly go through, hopefully quickly, doesn't always happen quickly, like what this poem is actually saying and getting at, and maybe talk about some of like the cool sound things going on inside the poem. But then we'll shift over to this discussion. But it's important to like know this poem to talk about that stuff. So, and here I go over the tribulation of decision and illusion of care. First thing, care. You almost forget about this by the end of the poem. Care. But here I go over the tribulation, the difficulty, the effort, the trial of decision, the tribulation of decision, the difficulty in deciding, the pain, the effort in, doing anything, of action, and the illusion of care. So we posit that care is an illusion. Bringing in this question of like morality. What is care? Why does care not exist? But what we're saying, here I go toward my trial of doing something. And the illusion of care. Could also be the tribulation of decision and the tribulation of the illusion of care. I think it's probably just like the tribulation of decision, and then here I go over the illusion of care. Here I go over. We're trying to move past this, right? A carousel of Republican sighs and counteroffers to stupid choices. So we're coming back to this idea of decision, choice, stupidity brings in morality, Republican sighs and counteroffers. We can see this as Republican in the U.S., or we can see this as Republican as like a general form of government. A republic is arguably like kind of based on voting and like senators and stuff. So size and counteroffers, it's this like politicking. Either way, we're kind of talking about this like stagnant government, this sentiment of like non-change and non-action, the difficulty of coming to a decision, the tribulation of decision, counteroffers to stupid choices, and there's this issue, if we're talking like modern America, where the stuff is so stupid and outlandish that we don't go anywhere. We just don't do this, right? Yeah, I feel like reading the character excerpt would inform so much more of what I'm trying to do, lol. Here I was trying to explain the idea of someone who lives vicariously in their dreams because they are so strung out. Yeah, I mean, like, either way, like, just reading the poem of yours will, like, help us, right? If we're reading the poem, then we're just, like, it gives a place at all to start the discussion and start talking about actual poetry, right? And then we can use that as a framework for this discussion, even if we don't necessarily, even if it doesn't totally concern the content of this, right? And that's okay. Marissa, VIP Marissa, a very important Marissa. Welcome in, and welcome in, Raiders. My name is Imogen. Hi, this is me. In big screen, but we're going back to the poem because that's what we do here. We talk about poetry. We're currently reading a poem from Prole0 about death and stuff, but also having discussions about poetic voice and what that means and how we attain it and play with it. Yeah, how was your stream? Welcome. And for those, I've shouted out so many people during this stream. I feel like I've shouted out like 4 different streamers today. But if you're here in my chat and you don't follow or are not familiar with VIP Marissa, they, she, they, she, I don't remember. I'm sorry. Are cool and know a lot about mushrooms of many kinds and have a very cozy stream and often talk about philosophy, which seems to be something that we often talk about on this stream. And for those from your land, Marissa, we talk a lot about poetry, and that often means philosophy and thinking. We try to engage with stuff critically. Even if you're not a poet, we're really just trying to take words and analyze them and get meaning and value from them, which anyone can do, no matter one's familiarity with the art itself. It was good. We did art and played Mahjong. I've never played Mahjong. But we also watched a video from author Brandon Sanderson. Brandon Sanderson. Fantasy. My computer is currently being held up by 2 Brandon Sanderson books, Rhythm of War and the second one in that series. He's aight. I used to like him more than I like him now, but I've sort of moved in other directions. More of a fan of literary fiction and poetry and classics than I am fantasy anymore. Unless it's Ursula K. Le Guin. She's great. So, we're going to jump back into the poem. And I'll read these first 2 lines and then we'll keep going through it. And here I go over the tribulation of decision and illusion of care. A carousel of Republican sighs and counter-offers to stupid choices. So we're establishing this difficulty in choosing anything in this like wishy-washy government non-choice. The idea that it's difficult to just do anything at all, which I think goes beyond government and into the human condition itself, arguably. If we're talking about death, probably relevant. No one is ever going to want me because I hate the path of death, the path of others. No one is ever going to want me. Slightly edgy, maybe, but you know. Yeah, Brandon Sanderson's all right. Thank you for the bits. I appreciate it, Prole0. So, definitely a dramatic proclamation. Very relevant topic, yeah. No one is ever going to want me. But I think it's an emotion many have felt. So not necessarily making fun of that. No one is ever going to want me because, important, because why? I hate the path of death, the path of others. And this has a feeling of I'm trying to think. I don't want to pull it too much in the direction of other philosophies, but so we'll just say the path of others. The others we're talking about, are these sighing, hemming, and hawing Republicans, be it U.S. or generally those who sort of care for the broad opinions of others, the path of others, this sort of democratic consideration, which maybe bogs down action, immediacy. So, and then, we could also say the path of death is the path of the American Republican, the bigot, the zealot, whatever. Making our views clear for anyone coming in here. Fuck ICE and all that. I presume if you're watching VIP Marissa, you're gung-ho with all that. I hate the path of death. So that could be, bigotry and dogma. But that could also just be sort of engaging in externality. This poem could be very political. It could also be very personal. Just any, sort of to think too much about how you are seen, to be concerned with others, and living reactively as a counteroffer, living to, care gets into some moral question. But, to be concerned with identity, to be concerned with externality instead of one's internal self. The poem could definitely go in that direction. Without politics, my fantasy series is just people sword fighting and bringing each other back to life. Yeah. Fantasy wouldn't be so interesting without that stuff. Most stuff is political. Anyway, continuing. We're just trying to go through this pretty quick. I fall through sleep, awake and brazen with Christian spite. This, I will note as a line, maybe ties us more directly to America, though not necessarily, because there's a lot of Christians in other places, but Christian spite, Republicans, likely connection. I fall through sleep, awake and brazen with Christian spite to every other because I see myself dying in reverse. This is a pretty complicated line, right? I fall through sleep, literally it seems, awake and brazen with Christian spite. 2. Every other, because I see myself dying in reverse. We're both awake and we're both asleep, right? I fall asleep awake and brazen. It's not awaking with, right? I don't think we're waking up. It reads to me as I fall through sleep, awake and brazen with Christian spite. Because it wouldn't make sense to say I fall through sleep awake as a verb, I awake, which isn't really a verb, it's just wake. So we'll have to read it that way. I am asleep. I am also awake with Christian spite. The Christian spite, to just scan this sentence, is to every other. because I see myself dying in reverse. Adding in another sort of new concept to the poem. Dying in reverse. Moving toward birth, right? Moving from death toward birth, coming more to life. Yeah, I was trying to describe the most potent form of spite, and I feel like it describes that echo chamber Apache dogma. Apache. Yeah, when you're asleep, you really feel that movement and charge. Yeah, when you're asleep, you really feel that movement and charge. Fall through sleep awake and brazen. I don't know what you mean by that. When you're asleep, you really feel that movement. But, sleep, to feel in sleep is to dream, to be awake in sleep, to have this energy or this thought in sleep. I guess that's where my mind goes interpreting this, right? If you're seeing something in sleep, you are dreaming. The other thing is to be awake and to be asleep because you are subject to dogma, right? I fall through sleep, this going through the motions of belief, although I am awake and I am brazen with spite because I'm mindless. To every other because I see myself dying in reverse. And, that makes sense. I see myself dying in reverse, maybe in a Christian sense. I charge toward death, but death is rebirth, and so I don't really die in the end. There's like this confidence. And definitely something to think about is who I is here. I seems to be the zealot, the Republican sire and the Christian spiter. A little contradictory, maybe, because we have this described as like stupid choices, but this could be like a suspension into omniscient narration or something. But there's a lot going on. I'm just gonna keep plowing through it though. Yeah, it's that abandonment of everything for your dreams, all in anticipation of that big sleep, not fear. I see. Giving everything over to belief. Gotcha. One step over the other, falling into the blistered sky once and over again. So we have this again, this height, right? This ambition, dreams, like you say. One step and on to the next I fall through. I fall through sleep, burning and old. This is a thing we have associated with death. Death as, the candle burning oneself out. One step and on to the next never gets better, always gets worse. And yeah, I guess if one is charging toward ambition, charging toward dream, one is just moving toward death. Well, dying in reverse, moving toward a dream. I is me 6 years ago. Okay. Good to know that it's a pretty like immediate poem to oneself. That is something important. So teaching time, Prole0. I in the poem. Right? I would say in modern poetry, it is most common for I to be assumed as the poet. This is like a kind of historical context of our time, is that the majority of poetry has shifted, I would say, since the modern era which is like the 1900s, to confessional, to poetry of confession, where I is the poet, and the words on the page are intended to be understood as coming directly from the source, the writer. This is sort of an assumption we can make. However, it's not always the case. And sometimes we write poetry where I is someone else. And write I, but the poem's I from the perspective of God is I. I can write a poem where I is this water bottle, right? And that's like totally cool. And this actually might be something you could look at practicing, Prole0, is writing a poem from the perspective of another something, another person, sure, but you could also write it from the perspective of an object, another thing. You could write it from the perspective of a concept. What does a poem look like if love itself is writing the poem? What does a poem look like if death itself is writing a poem? And this might help you as practice because, like you said, your goal is to sort of write as the characters in your books. And doing something like this, writing this way, not from yourself, but writing from a character, writing from another, could be helpful. Like if you literally sat, we'll just use this poem as an example, and said, I'm going to write a poem as if I am a Republican Christian zealot, let's say. Someone you don't like can be especially good because you really have to remove yourself from yourself. Or an exercise I love is like, think of the worst person in the world. Maybe that's someone who, touches children, or someone who kills something in some way or abuses animals or whatever. But to conjure up the very worst individual you can imagine. And then this is just an exercise. I learned it from someone else. And then to write not about them, but as them. And you could write prose too. That's totally fine. This could be poetry, this could be prose, this could be nonfiction, like the fiction of writing someone writing nonfiction. And this is an incredible exercise, especially if you try to escape your own style. Where you say, I write the way I write. Maybe you write with repetition because it's you. But maybe this person wouldn't write with so much repetition. They wouldn't write with the same rhythmic kind of dense wittiness that you're using here. This poem's very like things bounce off of each other. They're very interconnected. Identifying the ways you write and then choosing to write different could be helpful to you. To be clear, I'm the most liberal person. I get it. Wrote this trying to describe a concept that terrifies me. I am Christian, but not like that, lol. Yeah, so don't worry. Just trying to use strong words. Yeah, I get it. I think I can tell from like this framing. That line is enough to understand you're not like an evil person. But yeah, wrote this trying to describe a concept that terrifies me. And it sounds like the concept that terrifies you is this complete turning over into like abandoned faith, right? I think you said it before as well. What did you say? I forgot. Where did you say it? I don't know. I think you sort of explained the poem. Oh, it's that abandonment of everything in your dreams, everything for your dreams, all in anticipation of that big sleep, not fear. Yeah. So, to pursue something entirely. It's a terrifying thing to like turn oneself over to that and not be critical, to not be self-critical. I see who I am and chart a map to the end, a means to an end, a meaning to the end. And this line maybe grabs that idea very succinctly, right? I see who I am, this person, and instead of like appreciating this thing, having some, sort of connection to self and thinking of oneself and one's needs, one is simply something to draw a map to the end. Life is a means to an end, everything for a goal, a meaning to the end. That, the process and the goal gives meaning to the fact that things will end. People who are entirely devoted to, like, I don't know, doing something worthwhile, something that will be like remembered. The constant premonition of your utterly meaningless legacy. Yeah, legacy. Oh, more like abandonment of life for faith and dreams, hand in hand with the constant premonition of your utterly meaningless legacy. Okay. Abandonment of life. To not care about. I see. So we're like illusions of care. Abandonment of life for faith and dreams. Yeah, so okay. So if I'm understanding it correctly, then it's someone who places all meaning, right, in something ideal, something idealized, dreams, faith, something out here, right? And then basically as a response, right, to the fact that oneself is meaningless. So it's sort of like an anti-absurdism where nothing matters and one is afraid of that. So one becomes attached to things, faith, dreams, external stuff. And this mindset is very dangerous because one is like on a fundamental level has no care for life. And then like the extrapolation of that is just like do more and like sort of do like the maximalist dream. I think that's what I understand. That's what I understand it to be. Maybe I'm misinterpreting. Sorry, I almost thought my high school were head-splittingly grim. Well, it's high school. We do that. It's understandable. One step and on to the next never gets better, always gets worse. See who I am and try to map to the end, a means to an end, a meaning to the end. I want to feel how I feel when I sleep. Unthinking, free. I chart a line and cross it, falling on my next step. One step closer as I invert again, falling to my death in reverse. Not being caught by the grave, but thrown. I want to feel how I feel when I sleep. I chart a line and cross it, falling to my next step. So, I will say, Prole0, something useful here. This poem is very, it's very, raw, right? It's very sort of, visceral. There's a clear just, anger and frustration and this, repeated over and over again, intensity. It's, a very intense poem, right? And that is like fundamentally motivated, or let me say, yeah, like the idea of everything here is this constants is literally useless. I want to fly now. It's the idea that really made me realize why I put so much real life emotion into my writing, and that needs to be controlled and understood. Yeah, like the idea of everything here in this constants is literally useless. I want to fly now. Okay. It's the idea that made me realize why I put so much real life emotion into my writing, and that needs to be controlled and understood, at least for me at the time. Gotcha. And you also said something up here, which I want to call back to. I forgot where you said it. Where did you say it? I'm looking for something you said. Okay. So you said earlier, to be clear, I'm the most liberal person, but I wrote this trying to describe a concept that terrifies me. Right. And I think that is like evidenced in this poem is, it's coming from an emotion. It's very frantic. It's very energetic. It's very intense. Like this poem has that quality of fear. The sort of just very impulsive, direct feeling of that. Like I think it does come across, that it is afraid. And I think when you're trying to write a poem as a character, and you've probably done this just like writing dialogue as characters or writing stories with characters at all, is, it's hard, but, if you want your character's poem to be impactful, to be effective, to feel like it has emotion, one way to do this is to try to capture or try to understand this underlying emotion, right? If we understand this and the character's emotion and the place they're coming from and really like get in their head, because this poem is very like in your head. This poem is very heady. This poem is very visceral. This poem isn't really providing a lot to the reader, right? It's like, this is my feelings and they are intense and they're powerful. If you want to write something that's like this, which maybe you do, maybe you don't, you would want to get into the head of the character and get their emotions. And you'd come out with something very like raw and very confessional. Also, though, you probably want to think like, would my character write like this? Because there are a lot of ways to approach poetry. And if you stick around on the stream, I think like in many streams, or if you go watch the VODs, I think you'll notice that like there is an incredible amount of breadth in the way people write and in the way people approach poetry or seem to approach poetry and talk about their poetry and the way people engage with and critique poetry. Like sometimes we have very different decisions between me and chat. And I think seeing that, right, exposing yourself to those things, reading lots of different people, could be very helpful, because then you can look at like your individual character in your book and you can say, does this person write with an incredible amount of impulse, intuitively, where they just throw emotion down onto the page? Does this character write, how would this character approach poetry? Would they be methodical? Would they be like I don't know, we have a person in this community in the Discord. Their name is Shake My Spear. Um, they're incredibly precise and methodical and like intentional down to the word, and they write verse. And, these are entirely different things. Is your character sentimental? Would they write poetry dripping with sentiment? You know, gratitude, like Mr. Aegis. This was a very like sentimental poem. Uh, would your character write poetry of anger and rebellion because that's who they are? Um, there are so many ways to write poetry. Would they write poetry to escape? Or would they write poetry to vent? Etc., etc. I think reading a would they would they write poetry to experiment with form? Right. The list goes on. What, this is like 8 things. That's just in like a minute of thinking. But I think I would invite you to, one thing is to broaden, right? The more poetry you read, which I know you probably want to be reading like a lot of fantasy too, just because you write fantasy fiction. That's fair. But the more you expand outward into like different people and different styles, you'll find like the possibilities of what is possible. And I don't know how much poetry you've read, really. If you've already read a lot of poetry, then this is not maybe super helpful. But that's one way you could approach, like, making your character's writing better. Another thing, right, is imitation, which is a whole nother ballgame, which you could use too. Yeah, I'm mostly writing a character's manifesto who is very debated and criticized throughout. I decided to approach a motif of parents leaving letters for each of the characters in different ways. Some are diaries, recordings, and a love letter to the main character and stuff. But that manifesto is the main plot point and needs to be well written. It is like beyond my skill level. Oh, so you're trying to write this person's like poetic and philosophic like masterpiece text of their ideology, and you need to capture that. The manifesto is the message to his son in this metaphor because he's a world-altering conqueror. Okay, so let's do this one. This is another way you could do this. To write like other people. One thing, knowing all the options of how you could write. Imitation, though, is like the immediate practice of writing like someone else. And like this happens naturally on its own, and this happens intentionally. Where, for example, there was a point of my life where I was reading a ton of poetry by a guy named Bukowski. Who this guy is doesn't really matter. He's kind of shitty as a person. But I was reading like a ton of his poetry, and over time, my own poetry, started to like naturally sound like Bukowski. And that was kind of cool because I wasn't even really trying to write like Bukowski, but it was just like seeping into me through the context. And so one thing you could do is find someone who writes like how your character wants to write. So someone who writes like a world-ending conqueror. Now, that's sort of vague, but right, this person is probably like zealous and angry and probably like has or desires power. A lot of people like this exist, right? Um, Arguably, you could go read manifestos. Um, be careful, but like you could probably go read like the Unabomber's manifesto, right? And like, so I need characters who need to sound like the Romans, some empires, and that sound like heartbroken teenagers. Oh, it does have that broad fantasy scale, but I promise you it's more personal and slow, honestly. Yeah. So you need that. Fucking voice attacks. Yeah, you're good. Um the manifesto. Okay. So like, people who are writing manifestos are deeply ideologically impassioned. And like, there are plenty of manifestos hanging around. You can read Marx. The issue is like these things are also kind of hard to read sometimes. Marx's manifesto is not that hard. You can read like Kaczynski's manifesto. You can read like some crazy like right-wing school shooter manifesto. Like, arguably it's not the greatest reading material. Um, you can read the manifesto of some environmentalist organization. Blah blah blah. But like, if you read these things, and probably multiple of them, you might start to pick up on like what sounds what makes a manifesto sound like a manifesto, what makes a zealot someone who believes something, what makes someone who has a cause sound like they have a cause. Because if you don't yourself, then like you got to study. And then something else you can do, like let's say you find one of these and they sound kind of like how you want to sound, right? I want you to read it so bad. Okay. um, you can, you know, let's say you find Marx readable. Um, you could take Marx's manifesto and read it over and over again and like study and say, now I want to try to write something in the way that Marx writes. I want to write my manifesto like Marx in his writing style, but with my topic. Um, that might be helpful. um, but yeah, I mean, it's quite the thing to approach. Um, yeah, you want me to read it so bad? I think that makes sense. It does go. It's sort of unrelated to this poem itself, right? Maybe we can just put it here. Boom. Now we have it. Do not call yourself my brother if you are not my armor and extension of my arms. Okay, that's kind of awesome. The world speaks of me as a bridge burner, leaving my life's vacuum before their polite time, and I would without thought destroy our bond and make you my enemy. Do not call yourself a soldier if you do not fight. If you do not tend to the weary and fortify the fortuitous, these men are far and scholarly and behave in the writing of God. But some do not live in God's light. They live under his hair above them and will not move to see him. We sit ultimate as the beasts of the world. We are the writers of God. Do not call yourself my brother. Do not call yourself a soldier. What is written in your soul defines you. And in your dreams, you will see your dream either of betterment or of ruin. And that is your nature. The writing of Jack Thaliard, 8 years after the Battle of Transit. I mean, it sounds pretty impassioned, and I mean, I'm not an expert on manifestos, admittedly. Uh, it's not totally my area of expertise. um, But I mean, this stuff like, do not call yourself my brother if you are not, right? These things, like, I think some of these things are very effective for the feeling. We have like bonds and brothers and soldiers and like the fortuitous. We have like some and us. We have we and we have others, right? And I mean, I think this is just like uh, already something you're doing well of like when you take like when you become ideological on like a fundamental level, what you're doing it's like identifying with an idea, an ideal, and then like those who are like you, who identify like you, are part of the in group, and those who don't are part of the out group, right? Republicans, Democrats. Uh, you see it on the left. You see leftists. You see Marxists who like mostly agree with anarchists, who like mostly agree with I don't know, like other people in the left who mostly agree with syndicalists or whatever, blah blah blah. And these people like hate each other, like on a personal level. Like these people don't get along because they're so focused on identifying with their in group that everyone else becomes the out group. Like that's what dogma is. Um, Dogma is identity, regardless of ideology. And so the language that's like, do not call yourself my brother, right? There's us and there's them. There's the holy, there's the writers of God, and there's the people who are, you know, acting against us. I think that stuff's like really good. Um in terms of like having that effect, right? I think this is the thing you're talking about me wanting to to read. Um but like and then like, manifestos are moral. They're like we should act this way, we should do this. This is what is right. So these things of like, you know, um I think manifestos are often action. They're like how we should act, what we should do, whether or not that's right. And maybe bringing in more like specific action to something like this. I mean, this is short, right? But manifestos are a call to like change something or act in a certain way or believe in something, right? For the Communist Manifesto, it's to rise up and cast off your chains or whatever. For Kaczynski, it's like to bomb buildings and kill innocent people in the name of the environment or something. Um, you know, like, so, and a lot of this is very like, do not call yourself this, blah, blah, blah. But I'd love to see like, we are the people who do this. We are the people who act in the right way, you know? By the end of this book, he's largely considered a villain, but this is all his pent up rage from the first book turning him into this. He's more of a cautionary tale for his son leading into the third book. Yeah, and I love this line. The world speaks of me as a bridge burner. It's very defensive, right? Gets into this idea of identity. Where like people say I'm wrong, but I'm right. You know, I'm the one who's good. Whatever. Yeah, you're on the money. I should read some of that stuff. I've been reading Dostoevsky and Poliston and Neil Stevenson because I want to mind if mirror mirror the Russian Revolution. Okay, so yeah, like definitely reading stuff like that. You could also like, listen to like McCarthy and like Nixon and like these like Red Scare kind of speeches. I don't know who Fred Hampton is and Neil Stevenson. Um, but like these people are really like authoritarian, dogmatic, and in fact are sort of at their time they were the rulers of the world because America is, you know, like the global superpower. Um, like arguably American politicians are a great reference for sick and twisted, um, you know, yeah, autocracy, right? Um, so those are all directions to take. Um, and I think the poetic flair is very helpful for that stuff. Marx wrote poetry. A lot of these people write poetry. Um, yeah. Uh, we are careening toward a stand up and move and rest your mind break. Um, maybe we'll talk about this a little bit more afterward because it's interesting. Um, but yeah, we're gonna take a break from this. It's interesting. There's a lot of mental stuff though. And maybe we'll talk just directly about that stuff because we've sort of moved away from poetry and that's fine because this isn't strictly a poetry channel, even though it's mostly a poetry channel. Um, so yeah, I'll be right back. And yeah, hello, welcome back. Welcome back. Um, I hope that was a good break. Um, I had a thought while taking that break. A question for you, Prole0. Have you read Dune? Have you read this book? Because I feel like, based on what you're trying to write, um, this book really falls into like a similar, feels similar, um, for a lot of reasons. I've seen the movies countless times, and I have 3 copies, and I've read 0 pages. Okay, so you know the general story, but the thing with Dune is I remembered that at the start of a bunch of the chapters of this book, right? Oh, trying to get through Game of Thrones, that makes sense. Dune might be better. It's good that you never stop reading and never stop. Um, like Dune has, so I mean, you know, it's about Paul, like this guy who becomes. I mean, he rises into like the dogmatic theocratic leader of a galaxy spanning religious war, right? So like kind of fits, right? I mean, it's a fantasy book. Dune is fantasy as much as it's sci-fi about this like dictator and his rise to that point. And the start of a bunch of the chapters have like literal quotes from like in-world historical texts, right? Quote from the collected sayings of Muad'Dib. I know this is like kind of blurry. By the Princess Irulan, right? And he's like, the concept of progress acts as a protective mechanism to shield us from the terrors of the future, right? Which is very like sort of manifesto like saying. Here's another one. Deep in the human unconscious is a pervasive need for a logical universe that makes sense, but the real universe is always one step beyond logic. So it's sort of like doing this thing of having these in-world texts that like are written by people. I wonder if there's a lore book with all of these writings. Some franchises get stuff like that. There might. Um, but like, and since he's like literally a spiritual leader, these are like, how often it is that the angry man rages denial of what his inner self is telling him, right? And I feel like it might be a great model for what you're trying to do. Um, oh, and then this one, right? From Muad'Dib, The Religious Issues. Um, you cannot avoid the interplay of politics with an orthodox religion. This power struggle permeates the training, educating, and disciplining of the orthodox community. Because of this pressure, the leaders of such a community inevitably must face that ultimate internal question. To succumb to complete opportunism as a price of maintaining their rule, or risk sacrificing themselves for the sake of the orthodox ethic. Right? Like, that's literally like, that's manifesto type shit, being used, directly quoted from a book within a book. um, and I mean, in general, Dune is just hyper political and a very well written book, and touches on all sorts of themes and power and leadership and that kind of stuff. So that might be one for you to look into as a book recommendation. Uh, I haven't read Game of Thrones, so I don't know how it stacks up against that. Um, but yeah, I'd say, if you're trying to write a manifesto, read real life source material, read how it's done otherwise in fantasy, and in other genres too. Um, imitate as much as you can. Uh, and I'd say like, um, um, what was I gonna say? Dune. My brain just stopped. Not sure. Oh, I guess one thing to think about is, you know, a manifesto is a life's work often. Not always, but it's like, it is the concise description of a very specific ideological hill that, right, like, that person is going to die on. And I think, the more you build out the character and the more you build out their beliefs and their fears and the things that they truly rage at within your world, um, the better you'll be able to write this manifesto. And I mean, those are the sorts of things that like come about in real life over like years and years of ideological like radicalization. Uh, you could even think about, write this manifesto as if this person was writing it 50 years before the point in the story. Let's say they're 60 and they have like the inkling of this belief when they're a young person. And then like as an angry 20-year-old, and then later as a 30-year-old, like how has this belief developed and changed throughout their life? Up to the point where the actual, manifesto is written, because, ideological standpoints change over time, right? Uh, I've been personally, let's say, radicalized left throughout my life. There was a point where I was like, sort of apolitical, non-aware, And then I became like socially left and accepting of like queer people and stuff because I started to interact with that. And then I became very socially left and didn't really know anything economically until I learned about like leftist economic ideas. And then I moved toward like maybe sort of like a social democrat, there should be welfare. Um, and then I got pushed further, maybe in terms of socially left when I became queer. And then that had me interact with more people who were further economically left than me. And then I got pushed in that direction. So, like, economic beliefs, right? Like, Rome isn't built in a day, and ideology isn't built in a day. And I'd imagine there are a lot of points in this character's life, a lot of decisions that have led them to the point of becoming ultra radicalized Lord of the World, right? So, probably important to consider. I mean, world building. I also don't. I do D&D campaigns. I haven't written a novel, so I don't know how helpful this would be. Dune is fantastic and gross, and David Lynch is rolling in his grave. Game of Thrones is apparently like twice as dense, but a lot less angrily political. Yeah, Dune Dune has an aspect of like real world connection, um, and sort of activism. My favorite parts of Dune is all the pupating they do later. It's very yes, not a demon worm, a god worm, Leo, a god worm. Um, so yeah, I want to turn into a god worm too. uh, the series starts and ends with this character's grave. So I feel like it's exactly the conflict you're describing. This whole story is his hell. Yeah, like get into that guy's head. In the first book, his writing is mainly about mercenary rights. The reason for his fame was his tactic and philosophy of only fighting fair and never overpowering the opposing force. His father was a slave, and then in the second book, 8 years later, he's lost his spouse and children, and after that part, you read he bombs a building with planes. So there is that growth in his writing already. Yeah, and I mean, it sounds like you've got a lot of this covered, and you're already going in like a really good direction. And even what I'm reading already, like the spirit is definitely there. And um you know what I've learned so far, I'm only 21, but I've learned that for writing, all you really need to do to learn how to write is to just read and be critical, um, of other people's work, of your own work. I mean, this is what I do here. Like every time I stream, I learn more about poetry on like a very personal level. This stuff teaches me stuff. And as long as you're reading and finding things that are relevant, and getting recommendations is helpful too. Um, Finding relevant texts, engaging with them, analyzing them, saying, how can I use this in my art? Being critical of your own art and like striving to improve it. Like, you'll be fine, you know? Um, and like it sounds like you have a very strong concept for what you're doing, which is always good. It sounds like you've done a lot of world building. So, I mean, that's cool stuff. That's cool stuff. Um, you know, I want to read it if it's good. Um, is it continuing? Is what continuing? Stream? Uh, I mean, stream is currently continuing. Like, stream is, I'm still live. um, I don't know how much longer it's going to be continuing because I'm feeling the tiredness behind my eyes. Um, Overall thoughts on Untitled. I mean, it's definitely like a young poem, right? It's very like intense and raw, and I think there are um I think the distinction between like I of the poem and the thing that is feared um is something that was tripping me up when I was reading this, right? Um like in terms of like actual critique. I don't often give critique, but um I think um so that was sort of that makes the interpretation of the poem itself a little hard, right? And that's okay. I really like the some of the sound things happening. Like I kept saying, a carousel. I think that's very fun. Um, this like one step over repeating thing, really drilling in the idea of this like belief and the future and this like imminent sort of thing. Um, and I like the coming full circle. We didn't really like fully analyze the meaning honestly and genuinely. Sort of went off to the like off track to the stuff that you more wanted to talk about, and that's fine. Um, but uh, I think it like it's doing a lot of things well. You know, the sound, the energy, the emotion, and I think all of that a little bit muddies what it's actually trying to say, which is fine. The meaning is only one part of a poem, and it it very much captures that intensity, and I think that's something that happens with early poems, right? Is it's just like throwing shit at the wall, throwing emotions out onto the page. And there's nothing wrong with that. That doesn't make it like bad.